Cindy for acknowledging that Rena and I are becoming great grandparents. It is an extraordinary privilege in life to be able to live long enough to see another generation. And to be able to follow that up by seeing another generation is, again, privilege not everyone is given. And now here we are to become great grandparents, and we recognize that that is an honor and a privilege, a special opportunity that we treasure. And again, we praise God for all the blessings that are ours to be able to enjoy such anticipation.
Well, Paul, you're younger than I am, and I have only two grandsons.
We
Did I
did.
make a mistake somewhere?
Yes, you must have made a
We
mistake.
have eight.
I went to Taiwan. I fled the place.
Yeah, you didn't spend enough time with your sweetheart.
Hey, Paul,
Yeah.
you and Rena have always been great grandparents. Now you get to be great grandparents.
Well, thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for our speaker underway. And so this evening, again, our speaker is Josh Gehly, and it is going to be a little bit unique and different this evening because as I get to the screen share, I don't have the normal pattern, but hopefully I do have. Whoop, yeah, is that sharing? There, do we get a good flower to share?
Yes.
Frangipani? All right. And so if you'll bow with me in prayer, then we'll give as much time as we can to Josh because what he's presenting for us this evening, I think, will be of mutual interest and require some time for comment and question afterwards. Dear Lord of heaven, earth, and everything beyond, we bow this evening recognizing all your creation, especially in the springtime. It is holy ground. We come to study and examine ourselves in light of Book of Mormon scripture, each with our own persuasions, perspectives, most of which we claim because we are so sure. And yet, as we humble ourselves to see each other's views, we find ourselves nudged a bit to open to your cues. This evening, we ask your blessing on Brother Josh Gehly and his wife and son and their soon to be born baby, as he shares with us an example of a Book of Mormon map, an exercise many of us have tried, yet most with application mishap. So we pray for guidance that we can come to understand that our process and destiny is wholly in your hand. Thank you, Lord, for the promise and the beauty of springtime, like the breaking forth of your word. We pray your blessing, that we appreciate your gifts for us, and that your word be heard. Amen. All right, Josh, you try to maximize the opportunity for you to share here this evening, because among other things, since you represent the Monongahela group, and undoubtedly there's going to be a bunch of questions that people will want to lay before you because of that unique position, then I'll give you the chance to give your presentation and respond to the questions too. Floor is
Sure.
yours.
Thank you, Paul, and I just greet everybody in the love of Christ. It's been a blessing. Some weeks when I'm able to hop on and have a Monday night available, although that's not always an option for me, but when it has, I've really enjoyed the presentations. You know, I see Frank Fry on. I was able to see his on Quetzalcoatl and some of the cultural background, and I caught Paul's the one week that he presented on. I believe that was San Lorenzo, right? Wasn't that
Yeah,
the?
the Jaredite Olbeck parallels.
Yeah, yeah. And having Jerry Grover on for that was nice too. I've been able to interview Jerry on a podcast or two, so it's good to be with everybody, and just hope you enjoy the presentation today. I'm gonna share my screen, and we'll get started. So present. Everybody can hear me okay?
Yes.
So I am a minister of the Church of Jesus Christ. Our headquarters is in Monongahela, Pennsylvania. And so you're just looking at a snapshot of our new website that we launched this year. And so if anybody is interested in just actually a lot of our pamphlets, I was telling this to Robert at the beginning, are available for free. Some of the songs that we sing are available to listen to, and it does a really nice job of capturing the feel of our family at the church. And so a blessing to share that with you. And also, although I've done a lot less of that over the last few months while my wife has been expecting our second child, I do run a podcast. I try and interview scholars on the Book of Mormon. I've enjoyed learning from professors and different ones on research that they've done regarding the Book of Mormon. So you can find that at bookofmormonhistory.com. It's a little website that I run, and the podcast is available anywhere. It's available on the website, but then you could access it through Alexa. You could just tell Alexa to play the Book of Mormon History podcast, or Apple Podcasts, or anywhere. So that's a little something I do. I've done about 8 of them, and try and do one quarterly, but I think lately that's been turning into once every 6 months or so. But the topic for tonight is mapping the Book of Mormon. And I know that if we asked probably hundreds of different people that have pursued this, there have been hundreds of different answers in regarding to making your own map. And I don't claim tonight to have a smoking gun. I think that this is a challenge that we as believers of the Book of Mormon, and Stephen as well, with his interest and even just being on these forums, there's different ways you can approach the text. There's different ways that you can emphasize or highlight what's important to you on presenting a map, creating a map. My map's not finished. I have like 50 maps that I'm working on, and in different versions and variations, and my poor wife endures that well, and it's still a work in progress. I haven't even touched what would eventually become maybe my interpretation of my real world setting, although I have general ideas of where I think it took place and agree with certain publications over others. But my mind's still open on certain aspects of it. This is by no means tonight are you seeing a finished product, but you're seeing my approach. And my approach is a little bit of my background. I have a degree in archaeological science. I have an anthropology degree from Penn State. And my background is really taking that, and I approach it then in a similar way to John Sorensen and some others, because I approach the text first and look at what the text shows me about the culture and the people within, and start to layer from there. So what you're going to see is my approach, and we're going to look at things like the scale, the geography, the topography, to try and build a foundation before we can ever approach it in a real world setting, creating that foundation from the inside out. Now, maybe Paul, I could get you to comment, and some others that have been on an excavation. By the way, you're seeing college tie-dyed Josh from 12 years ago in the picture on the right, as I'm at a historical site in Pennsylvania. We're excavating a farmstead from the early 1800s there, and I'm plotting in some of the site and probably equipment there that I probably couldn't use today if you threw it at me, because it's been a decade. But Paul or somebody else that's been on a dig, and I know that several of you have with Paul, what's the importance of a datum for an archaeological site?
Let me toss that one to David, my brother. He's the one that I've depended upon for the
She's
surveying.
talking about you.
Once the archaeologist gets through with the dig, there's nothing left behind. It's an empty hole.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have great records and great data, it's lost. And you've effectively destroyed what could have been answers to questions because you didn't record what you found.
Exactly. So when you excavate a site, you destroy a site, right? You completely destroy it by excavating it. And usually one of the goals when you're getting started and you're plotting in your squares, right, is you need that fixed point, that fixed datum point, that reference point to be able to build your map for all the other locations that you might dig off of. You have one fixed point that you then fire away, and you know where all the other sites are located in regards to that one fixed point, right? In general, usually that's the goal, so that you know and can map your site accordingly. So the key to mapping an archaeological site is having a known fixed point in order to plot it in. And David's absolutely right. That's so you can go back, because once you start excavating, there's no going back. Once you start digging down, you've dug. You're not digging again. The layers need to be recorded right. Your soils need to be sampled right. And so, you know, there's really two different rules when we go to mapping. You can have fixed points, or you can do something that's relative. We're used to, in our world, having latitude, longitude, and everything's at a fixed point. But there's also relational points when it comes to mapping as well. And so what I want to do to start is show you, this is a map that I've made, but you're probably going to see a version of this in a few weeks when George Potter presents on Book of Mormon in the Old World, the Arabian Peninsula, because whether you're looking at the publications of George Potter, or whether you're looking at the publications of Warren Aston or others that have examined the first Nephi text, in general, there's pretty broad agreement. There might be a little bit of debate on exactly which wadi might be Shazer, for example, out of First Nephi, but there's general agreement on the region of Bountiful. There's general agreement on Nahum. And part of the reason for that is because the Book of Mormon starts off in First Nephi. It starts off with a fixed point. If you think about that, First Nephi 1:4, it tells us, and here's Nephi writing to us, it says, "For it came to pass in the commencement of the first year of the reign of Zedekiah." Well, that's a date. The first year of the reign of Zedekiah, that's a date. We're getting a fixed point. "King of Judah, my father Lehi, having dwelt at Jerusalem in all his days, and in the same year there came many prophets, prophesying unto the people that they must repent, or the great city Jerusalem must be destroyed." So we have a date, a year. We have an event happening within that year. Zedekiah, the puppet king, is being appointed into his role by Nebuchadnezzar. And we have a fixed location, Jerusalem. Right there in First Nephi 1:4, we have a datum point from which you can examine the rest of Nephi's account and build a map from. And when scholars have looked at it, in general, the apologetic believing scholars come out very similar, because we have that starting point. Nobody finishes in Africa or Egypt. Nobody finishes Nephi's journey in Europe or somewhere else, because we have a fixed datum point, and Nephi gives us rough directions from there, and even names some sites that have some strong archaeological correspondences. When you look at Nahum, there's about 5 converging evidences for the archaeological site of Nahum, which I'm sure George Potter will get to later. So that's not my point of showing this. It's just to show that the strength of what you're going to see in George Potter's presentation that is sure to come is built on a number of evidences that correspond and converge together all around a starting point. And so, Nephi gives another fixed point when he says in First Nephi 2:5, he came down by the borders near the shore of the Red Sea, and he did travel in the wilderness in the borders which are nearer the Red Sea, and he traveled in the wilderness with his family, which consisted of my mother Sariah, my elder brother. So, the Red Sea is another point that we can draw and we can see on a map today. And through that, it enables us in a very different way than a New World Book of Mormon map. We have a couple of data points that Nephi gives us that then you can build off of. And when you do build off of it, we have some archaeological bullseyes, you have some geological bullseyes, some climate evidences for bountiful and different things that piece together really nicely because we have a starting point. And, the end result is usually a map that looks something like this for First Nephi, for their travels in the wilderness and their journey to the land of bountiful. Whether you're looking at George Potter in a couple weeks or somebody else, in general, it's going to look roughly like this. The challenge is then when we try and approach that to where they go to the promised land, right? The real challenge is, the evidences in the old world are strong and solid, but we don't have the same starting point when evaluating a new world geography for the Book of Mormon. So because of that, you will have times and places, not unlike, Jonathan Neville's presentation he gave a week or two ago, where his starting point is a statement from Oliver Cowdery and a statement from Lucy Mack Smith. The statement from Lucy Mack Smith is decades after the activating event, and she's not a primary witness. And Oliver Cowdery, who's also not a primary witness. So, while those are nice things, I'm not sure anybody that would be doing biblical archaeology would consider that. And that's something that I do when I try and approach this topic. Is there's some good research out there from scholars that do biblical archaeology, because if you know anything about biblical archaeology, there's huge debates from minimalists to maximalists on how you approach the text of the Bible and how you apply that to real world settings. And those debates aren't over yet. They continue today, and sometimes they're quite heated, and so I think it sets a platform for us to compare with the Book of Mormon, but not perfectly, because we don't have a starting point in the Book of Mormon of a fixed datum for us to build an internal map. So with that, we are stuck with doing relative examination and using criteria to try and create layers of criteria from the Book of Mormon, starting from the Book of Mormon first. My approach is the text, the inspired text of the Book of Mormon, the translated book itself, and allow that to build the criteria outwards. And that doesn't mean that that's going to be perfect. It doesn't mean that there won't be problems or things we didn't wish we had more information on. But my first step is always the book first. That's my data point for me to start from. And through that, establish criteria upon which you could layer and overlay a work that could then be built onto a real world setting. Before I even talk about a real world setting, first, I'm going to look at all 600 points that Mormon gives of the land of this, the wilderness of that, and see the consistency in which he does it and try and build an internal map. We're going to look at that in more detail. Things that are geographical that would be required, up and down, seas, rivers. Obviously, there's interpretation with all that, but can we build as a layer an internal map with geographical requirements? Then another step, are there key archaeological requirements? I'm going to argue yes to that today. So layer one, build a detailed internal Book of Mormon map. Layer two, build the parameters, the culture, the language, the archaeology, the social stratification of the people. Did they have writing systems? Did they not have writing systems? When were they writing? Where were they writing? cultural requirements, maybe some key geological requirements. Think about the destruction in 3rd Nephi for just as one example, maybe the most obvious example we could grab from. What can we glean from that? You know, when I read I'm not a geologist by any means. So when I read the 3rd Nephi account of the destruction at the time of Christ, what I think of is, wow, look at the judgments of God, which is true, right? Of course. But at the same time, someone like Jerry Grover, who we've had the blessing to meet on this platform, and also I've had the blessing to interview as a podcast, you know, he as a geologist looks at that and says, oh, wow, I have firsthand account of a cataclysmic event, which gives me criteria to establish what actually happened based on what the writers said in 3rd Nephi. So maybe not necessarily what God did, but the mechanisms of how he did it. And so to do that, Jerry Grover's done tremendous work. And Bart Koalis is another one that has evaluated that as a geologist, you know, looking at the 3rd Nephi account and trying to figure out, what happened? Well, that would be another layer, right? Because based on what a geologist would say, hey, this is what had to happen. Now we have some archaeological requirements, some cultural, anthropological requirements. We've built an internal map that could be stretched or twisted, but in general, we have some rules and regulations, laying that onto a real world setting. You know, when I first started approaching the text this way, you know, our group in general, our church is a church of former coal miners and farmers. So, you know, I'm actually 6th generation in the church. So my heritage in the Church of Jesus Christ, thank God, goes back to the mid 1800s, back to the days of William Bickerton for us. And so, you know, we were coal miners and farmers, uneducated people. So when I first started presenting this, you know, or thinking about or talking to it, I would get the reaction of, well, you can't really look at it that way because in 3rd Nephi, everything gets destroyed. The face of the whole land changes. And so you can't even approach the text this way. So I studied it out and I decided that rebuttal was actually not accurate. You know, before the 3rd Nephi destruction, the destruction at the crucifixion of Christ, the city and the temple bountiful are still present. Zarahemla's rebuilt. Mormon's the one that actually gives us almost all the geographical requirements in the Book of Mormon text, and he writes and edits the plates, compiles everything after this massive event happens. And places like Hill Cumorah and different lands are all still present before and after the Nephite, that great destruction. The narrow neck, the narrow pass, you know, they're all still there. So while the face of the land changed, it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't build an inside map, that we can't attempt this endeavor together. But we have to keep in mind a couple things. So I love the picture on the right. That picture is from the New Yorker. I think you can see the date, 1976. It does an awesome job of showing an ethnocentric and an internal perspective of America. This is like a world or an American map from the perspective of a New Yorker. And the artist is trying to show the perspective bias of somebody that's born and lives in New York. And right, what's their world? You know, how do they view America? Well, their world is all New York City, 9th and 10th Avenue, the Hudson River. Then look at what it is from Jersey to the Pacific Ocean. Look at how their cultural perspective is so limited because they don't know the landscape of what's beyond, right? So there's cultural bias, our viewpoint. And Mormon certainly would have had a cultural bias when he was writing, and we can see some incredible things from Mormon, right? He doesn't give us, when you look at his voice, and there's some great programs out of BYU. BYU has a program called Word Cruncher where you can search the Book of Mormon based on the author, the voice of who's speaking. And so when you examine Mormon, our famous general from the end of the Book of Mormon, our compiler of the plates, he knows the land northward pretty well. He knows the land bountiful in Zarahemla extremely well. He gives us times and days of travel. The land southward in the Book of Mormon, he does not give us days of travel very much. He does not give us a better lay of the landscape. And that's accurate because he never stepped foot in the land southward. Mormon never steps foot. So from a first person perspective, from Mormon's perspective, from his point of view, he doesn't know the land southward very well and doesn't describe it very well, which fits the text. But we also have to keep that in mind. So as we're trying to build a map, the author has an impact on that. His perspective matters. And we have to keep in mind that Mormon was living, in generally, Bountiful and Zarahemla is in the land southward, but it's north of the land of Nephi. And he doesn't give much south of that narrow strip of wilderness. Some of the things we're going to talk about in a minute. So also directions. I would love to tell you north is north and south is south. But as an anthropologist, as somebody that's reading the text, I have to understand that there might be a perspective that might be different than mine. That cultures like Hebrews, the Jews, their version of north was actually east, where they would think the top of the map was east, because that's where the sun rose. The Mayans are the same way. And directions aren't necessarily on a line. They're more like in a range, because you have things like the solstices where the sun moves. So east has a wider range than just this straight line. And again, it's then we have to have some flexibility for wherever you put the Book of Mormon in a real world setting. How did they view the directions? Many of you might recognize the medicine wheel here, where Native Americans have, their directions, and it's 4 directions, sometimes 5, depending on what medicine wheel you're using, right? But it's representing a larger area. All of a sudden, northward and southward is allowed to vary based on where you put it in, based on the culture you apply it to. So if you build a map and put it in a real world setting, your north, south, east, and west should match the culture of the people that you're placing it in, would be my position. And it's something for us to kind of put an asterisk next to look at. Scale. I think everybody, if I stop sharing just for a second, everybody's probably seen a map, and this is going to be way too big. I'm sorry. I was at my church building. It's not going to work, I think, with the light, but everybody has seen 100 years ago. I think the Restoration movement was really united on a map, because we all kind of had a map 100 years ago, whether you were in the Church of Jesus, where you were in my church, the Church of Jesus Christ, or whether you were Latter-day Saint, or what would become the Community of Christ, or others, RLDS at the time, or different Restoration branches. You probably had a North America down to South America map. But I think all of us have been studying this out and realized that's not the scale in the Book of Mormon. You can see John Sorensen's version of distances on the right, where he breaks down days travel to create a scale. But I do think it's safe to say, whether you're looking at Alma's group that travels for 21 days or Ammon's group that travels for 40 days, when you look at the distances traveled in the Book of Mormon, realistically, bottom to top, we're at 400 miles, 500 miles maximum, as far as a tip to tip, as far as a scale for Book of Mormon events. And all that you're doing to do that is taking days travel and examining what would be there's some variability there based on looking at different cultures and distance that somebody could travel for a day. But 400 to 500 miles would seem, I think, probably more than generous. Again, using the Book of Mormon text, days that people are traveling, to say, okay, how big is this territory that then I need to fit into a real world setting? And I think, honestly, to me, probably 300 to 400 miles is probably the most accurate we could come up with. Then when you start looking, and here's a snapshot I did from Google, Nephi does this in the old world, and certainly people in the new world, people in the promised land are doing this the same way. We read up and down in the Book of Mormon and don't even think about it, maybe. But I'll tell you, when Nephi says we traveled down from Jerusalem, he means elevation. They go down 2,500 feet down to the Red Sea, and then they go up from the Red Sea back to Jerusalem to get the plates. Then they go down from Jerusalem to the Red Sea to meet their father in the valley of Lemuel. Then they go up to get their wives back at Jerusalem when they go back for Ishmael. Then they go back down to their father. Consistency. Mormon does the same thing. Different authors across the Book of Mormon text do the same thing. Up and down is topography. It's giving us hints of topography. That's why I might contend with some of the conclusions from Jonathan Neville on, I might contend with their interpretation of which river's flowing north and why, because Zarahemla must be lower in elevation, not higher in elevation, than Nephi, based on the textual requirements of the inside map itself. It's fundamental at that point. And so things that we need to define in the text to even try and build a map and redefine, and I'm still working on this. I'm not going to show you the Excel sheet. I'm working through the entire Book of Mormon, laying out every cultural reference, and the Excel sheet's getting robust and crazy, and I'm a nerd, and it's okay. But every wilderness, what territory is it in, at what time, what's the social stratification of the group at that time based on the textual requirements, so that you can see the progression, the demographics, the whole bit. And this isn't new. Some people have done this in the past, and I'm certainly looking at John Clark and John Sorensen and others' works that have attempted to do this and comparing it with my own. But then, trying to define, well, what does wilderness mean? What does line mean? What is a sea? A Heartlander might define a sea as a Great Lake. Okay, let's look at that. We need to be consistent. What's a narrow neck or a narrow pass? What are the borders? What does it mean to go over or roundabout? I think the Book of Mormon authors certainly knew what they were talking about. We have to try and figure that out on our own and find our place and be consistent in our interpretation. I'll give you one that's important to me: the word line. The word line is really, it may seem like a funny one to pick, but Mormon uses the word line 5 or 6 times in the Book of Mormon. It's his voice, and he consistently recognizes it. It's a geographic feature. He identifies it as such, and it's a geographic feature that is sometimes strategic to build things. For example, Captain Moroni builds the city of Moroni as a fortification along the eastern seashore, and the line becomes a natural geographic barrier between the southernmost point of Nephite lands and the northernmost point of Lamanite lands on the eastern seashore. That line is really important. So important that the southernmost city that Captain Moroni builds and fortifies is the city of Moroni on this unnamed line. Of course, the famous line would be Alma 22, right? And interpreting this correctly can change your whole map. Interpreting this incorrectly could throw us into the wrong place. Alma 22:32. Now it was only a distance of a day and a half's journey for a Nephite. From where? On the line bountiful and the land desolation. Here again, we have a natural geographic feature, a line between separating 2 lands, bountiful and the land desolation, from the east to the West Sea. Thus, the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla were nearly surrounded by water. there being a small neck of land between the land northward and the land southward. So here's how I interpret line. I interpret it as a river. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I'm happy to try and defend that, but I don't care if you interpret it another way. But I'd argue if you interpret it another way, you got to be consistent with it, because the text is consistent in how it uses it. So I interpret line as river. Some ways that should be self-evident. You know, it's always separating lands. It's always an important and strategic thing. That certainly is true of rivers as a natural geographic part of the landscape. And if we apply that to what we would normally call the narrow neck, well, that would mean that there's a river that would flow between Desolation and Bountiful, between those lands, and it would flow into the East Sea, and the Nephites would be fortifying the day and a half's journey from the river, from the line, Desolation and Bountiful, from that line, from that river, from the east to the West Sea would be in a day and a half's journey, and that would be the area that the Nephites would be fortifying to prevent the Lamanites from coming up the West Wilderness, circling around and conquering the landscape. So if you interpret line as river, you might get an inside map that starts to look something like the very simple version that I've laid out on this slide. Okay, now if you interpret line a different way, as long as you consistently do it, I'm good. You know, but I think that is one possible interpretation. Interesting point, you know, Mayan, you know, languages, for example, I think Frank Fry might enjoy this, some others might enjoy this. You know, Mayans did not really have a word for river. What they would do is they would use their glyph for water, and they would have a line underneath it. And that would be how they would symbolize river. They did not have an actual word for river. Now that's taking it one step further and trying to talk about it in a real world setting. But be that as it may, if you build an inside map, you then have to try and make it fit into a real world setting. That's the next step. We're not doing that tonight. So now you have to do that, these type of interpretations for all these different words as you start. You have to try and define and refine what the authors are actually saying. Again, because we don't have a datum point to start out from. Here's a great version. I know Tyler Professor Griffith well at BYU. I've interviewed him on the podcast. Here's a version from virtualscriptures.org of an inside map. You know, and it's one that I certainly evaluate and cross-reference when I'm looking at this for myself. You know, I think it's not an impossible task, and I think there is some consistency that you see when you start evaluating the map this way. So I don't know how I'm doing on time, by the way, so just jump in anytime, Paul, as I go through this. I'm not sure where I'm at, but there's major geographic features that need to be accounted for. You definitely have a narrow neck of land. You know, that's from Ether 1020. They build a great city by the narrow neck of land, by the place where the sea divides the land. There's a narrow pass there. There's a fortified line there. The line's a natural barrier. Talked about that a little bit. So you have a narrow neck. You also have a big, giant, broad land northward. You have a big, giant, broad land southward. So any internal map certainly needs that feature. You need an East Sea and a West Sea. I think there's different ways to interpret the North Sea and the South Sea from Helaman, but without question, you need an East Sea and a West Sea. You need a river Sidon. That river does consistently flow north when you look at the topography and the text itself, and the fact that everything is always east of Sidon or west of Sidon, never north of Sidon, never south of Sidon. When you start to lay that all on top of each other and you look at the topography, Manti is right next to the narrow strip of wilderness. You're always going up to the land of Nephi from Zarahemla. You're always going down to Zarahemla from Nephi. The river definitely flows north. You need a city of Zarahemla, you need a city of Nephi. In general, it appears that those cities are within a greater landscape, that at certain times Zarahemla might be a city-state that was overseeing several cities at different eras of time. You have a narrow strip of wilderness that goes east and west, and seems to be a natural barrier between Zarahemla and Nephi. Nephi in the south, which is actually loaded with Lamanites. It's a fun play on words by the Book of Mormon authors. They never let the land of Nephi go. They always identify it with their own words and their own terms, even though it certainly was probably not called that by the Lamanites that were living there. You have the city of Bountiful. Hill Cumorah or Ramah is certainly a distinguishing landmark, and the land of first inheritance is your southwesternmost point on the map. So, those features must accompany any internal map and be laid out that way and have criteria. So, from the first step of establishing an internal map, that's the first step of an overlay, and that's what you would, certainly require. Now, when we start looking at archaeology, this is where somebody that maybe doesn't have the degree might not catch this at first. But when you're reading the Book of Mormon text, there are two state-level civilizations in the Book of Mormon. State-level societies would be how an anthropologist would call it. Civilization's a word that gets used around our culture a lot, but state level, what that means is anthropologists break down groups and organizations of people based on size and complexity. All right. And the Nephites and the Jaredites at their peak were very complex, layered societies. Let me give you an example. Captain Moroni was a general of a standing army. That was his profession. He was raised to be a captain. He was a captain. That was his job. That's what he was paid to do. It takes a certain level of complexity of society, of civilization to achieve that. Okay, so for example, a nomadic group of herders, a shepherding group of a tribe of people are not that complex in their social stratification. They don't have a standing general to oversee an army of people, right? So there's a level of complexity that the Nephites and the Jaredites achieve, and they both seem to achieve a state at certain points in their history. They have incredible stratification, achieved and ascribed leadership, dense population requirements. The people are urbanized. There's food surpluses that get talked about, and there's multiple scripture verses that can be given for each one of these. Labor specialization. What I mean by that is, think about this. There are markets in the Book of Mormon. People that are artisans, people that are, making things. So that takes a level of complexity beyond just a group of tribes. Now, it doesn't mean that one level of civilization or level of social stratification is better than another. That's not, bigger is not necessarily better. But, a band of 10 people, basically family groups that are hunting and gathering, have a different level of social stratification than Rome. The civilizations being described in the Book of Mormon approach in multiple ways more of a Rome type level of social stratification. So if we're trying to apply the Book of Mormon to a real world setting, you need to account for two state level societies, not chiefdoms like you find in the heartland, not chiefdoms. It requires state level social stratification for all the bullet points that I have lined out here, both for the Nephites and the Lamanites. And at the end of the Book of Mormon, the Lamanite civilization is thriving. We often look at it like it's like everything's breaking down at the end of the book. It certainly is. If you're a Nephite, your world has collapsed. You are done. But the Lamanite civilization is thriving and growing. So wherever you overlay it in a real world civilization, you can't have a group that peters out at the end of the Book of Mormon. You're looking for an area that at the end is booming, booming, because that's certainly true based on what Mormon and Moroni tell us. Another archaeological requirement of the text is writing. Now, I'm not picking some hieroglyphs here because I'm biased on where, but if you think about it, Ether clearly knows how to write at the end of the Jaredite text. You might argue that there may be some oral tradition that eventually gets written down when you're talking. Maybe you could make that argument for the early part of Ether for the Jaredites, but certainly by the end, writing seems to be present. And maybe a testimony to that is the fact that Mosiah gets something that he has to translate that comes from the Jaredite culture. So you have two evidences there for writing. The fact that King Mosiah is interpreting something that they wrote, and the fact that Ether certainly writes at the end as well. He's literate. And you have the Nephites and the Lamanites writing letters back and forth to each other. Their civilization is literate seems to be the entire time of the Book of Mormon text. So you need two different writing systems. In whatever place you place the Book of Mormon, the Book of Mormon seems to make that a requirement, that you would need two different writing systems that would be prevalent that you could to examine. Mention this a little bit, but if you look at it geologically, another layer. So, the internal map, some basic bare bone archaeological requirements, some basic bare bone geological requirements. If you look at 3rd Nephi, for example, the destruction, which I mentioned earlier, you have to account for a great storm, a strong and terrible, this is from the firsthand account of our writers there, strong and terrible tempest, terrible thunder, shaking of the whole earth, exceedingly sharp lightning, burning of cities, sinking of cities into the sea, earth carried up on cities, sinking and burial of cities, whirlwinds, breaking up of highways and earth, and others. You have a time period of about 3 hours and then 3 days of a darkness that prevails across the land and seems to be continual tremors, because at the end of the 3 days, the earth cleaves together. So a geologist looks at that and creates a set of requirements of what maybe happened to that. And so if you're placing the Book of Mormon in a real world setting, you need to look at the work of Jerry Grover and other geologists that have written about it and demonstrated what those catastrophic events could curtail and where they might have fit in a real world setting. I'll give you just a couple other little ones. There's a drought mentioned in Helaman, chapter 11. If you want to really test a hypothesis on where the Book of Mormon takes place, there are a couple different ways to identify if droughts have happened in a real place. Dendrochronology or tree ring dating would be one, and there's actually ways that even caves can be used to identify how much rainfall over what period happened in a certain place or a certain period of time at a certain place. So the drought of Helaman 11 might be a harder test, but could be something you could test, could be a layer you could apply. And actually, an excellent article I would recommend would be Let There Be a Famine in the Land by Jim Hawker, who published an article on the Interpreter Foundation evaluating the drought of Helaman chapter 11 and overlaying that in a real world setting. Another possible test, this is getting a little bit more minute, but that you could use to examine Book of Mormon as a layer to overlay onto a real world setting, is the snake infestation of Ether 9, where it says the land southward was infested by snakes. You know, something like this can happen, and this could be another testament of a drought. You know, in Ether chapter 9, you read about poisonous serpents. It's during a time of great dearth where there was no rain upon the face of the earth. That does fit. You have evidences of this in Australia and some other places that have lots of snakes, that when there's a drought, snakes will congregate to find water. They will try and find water. So actually the text fits what could happen in a case of drought, that snakes would congregate and pose a problem in a geographic area, but then you have to apply that to a real area. So another possible testable criteria comes from Ether 9. Now, we all read the text for its spiritual value. I know this is not how we normally read these things, as we build these layers, but you know, as I kind of come to the conclusion tonight, to me, we have a lot of wonderful people that join this forum and present wonderful opinions on the Book of Mormon. To me, let's put them to the test. In love, let's put them to the test. Did they build their model by starting with a detailed inside internal map? Is that their first step? Or is their first step some other step? To me, the correct scholastic endeavor would just be to start with the text. We're trying to apply the text to a real world setting. If you're not starting with the text, you are not actually building a hypothesis. Very simply, to me, as we look at different ones that present wonderful theories on this forum, I'd encourage you to consider, are they presenting societies, civilizations that achieve a state level society, that have inherited or approved leadership over time, cities overseeing multiple cities politically? Are they they're then obviously then they're growing their own food, they're farming, they have to be farming at that point for that to happen. You can't have the populations that are described in the Book of Mormon without farming. You can't. Farming is a requirement to achieve that level of complexity. Are we presenting a location that has at least two writing systems, at least one dating towards the end of the Jaredite time period, and another in the correct location during the Nephite and Lamanite time period? Writing certainly is a requirement in both civilizations we read about in the Book of Mormon. Is the person that's presenting a real world setting presenting it in a place that has a geological answer or testable hypothesis for the account of Third Nephi? And if you really want to get layered, you could even look at some of the last couple, some of the droughts, some of the more, that's pretty fine tuning if you get down to that level. But at the very bare bone basics, to me, my opinion would be, are we building a detailed inside map that we can then stretch, contort? There's certainly areas you can pull and push that map to put it onto a real world setting, but do we have something to place it onto a real world setting? Does the civilization at its fundamental level match the level of complexity described in the Book of Mormon and have writing systems? And is there a realistic geological testable answer for the account in Third Nephi? And if Jerry would ever present on here, I know he'd do a wonderful job, but I did interview him. If you want to know what those criteria are, I have an hour-long podcast where he and I dove into the geology of the Book of Mormon. He did a wonderful job. He's a brilliant man. There's a reason why I think Paul keeps referencing back to him, and every time he does, I give a thumbs up, because he's a scholar in his approach. So I'm not sure where I'm at on my time, but when I look at mapping the Book of Mormon, before I ever go to where is it actually in the dirt, this is Josh's rough criteria on what I'm looking for. And how do we evaluate that with even some of the presentations we're seeing on here, which are given by wonderful, sincere believers. They all believe in their maps. God bless it. It's great. That's great. It's good to have these discussions. The forum is wonderful. These are my criteria I use when I evaluate those maps based on the Book of Mormon itself informing me on where it might have taken place. So I hope you've enjoyed tonight. This is the presentation, Paul. Not sure where I'm at on time. So
Well, you're about out of time. We have 5 minutes left to record on the regular hour. I would anticipate there's a lot of questions yet to be answered. And I appreciate that you raised the point that there are spiritual values for us to look for as well. And I think we'll pick up on those next week with the testimonies that we have coming from the people that have volunteered. That's an area though where I would like to invite you to share one spiritually significant comment, and then we'll open to other questions.
you want me to share something spiritual?
Yeah,
I'd love to.
what spiritual value do you see coming out of the book?
I'll tell you, I find the gospel in its purity in 3rd Nephi 27 as given by Christ when he says, "This is my gospel." And I've evaluated that on Philippians. Paul quotes a early pre-Paul statement on the gospel, and it matches incredibly perfectly. Peter preaches the same gospel point by point on the day of Pentecost. And so we see the gospel presented in its purity at the Temple Bountiful, matching exactly what the apostles presented as the gospel of the New Testament, as it was given to them by Christ. And through that, we have a witness of ourselves, a testimony of ourselves we can stick in our pocket and preach to the moon that the gospel is the same. It never changed. It's everlasting and eternal. And the Book of Mormon bears witness of that gospel. And if you got another hour, I'll keep going on that. Because to me, out of the 2 presentations, this one's nothing compared to that.
I think we need to invite you back for the other one as well. But let's open to the questions on this one first. Ladies and gentlemen, your opportunity.